And then let me real quick introduce our three panelists today. First, we have Alexa Tarantino. Alexa has her two bachelor's degrees from the Eastman School of Music in saxophone performance and music education, and a master's in jazz studies from the Juilliard School. She has performed with Cecile McLaurin Salvant, Ulysses Owens Jr., Arturo Alfaro, and the Latin Jazz Orchestra and the Diva Jazz Orchestra, as well as her own group, among many others. Alexa does a lot of work with jazz at Lincoln Center, including being on faculty for the High School Jazz Academy and the Let Freedom Swing, or Jazz for Young People program. She is also the founder and director of Rockport Jazz Workshop and a Step Ahead virtual jazz workshop. So welcome, Alexa. Nice to see you. How are you?
Thank you, Andy. Thanks for having me. I'm great. So happy to be here, and really appreciate you having us virtually.
Our second panelist is Roxy Coss. Roxy has performed with such notable names as Clark Terry, Billy Kay, Maurice Hines, Rufus Reed, Louis Hayes, Claudio Roditi, Willie Jones III, Jeremy Pelt, Darcy James Argue, and also the Diva Jazz Orchestra. She is currently on the board of directors for GEN and is on faculty at the Juilliard School, the New School, and BMCC. And she is the founder of the Women in Jazz Orchestra, and which I'm sure we're going to hear a little bit more about later. So welcome, Roxy. How are you?
Thanks, Andy. I'm doing well. Also very happy to be here virtually. It's the Women in Jazz Organization, not orchestra.
Organization, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
That's what I read, is a little Freudian slip. And our final panelist is Mr. Bryan Carter, who also attended the Juilliard School, where he was a recipient of the Diamond Scholarship and Samuel L. Jackson Scholarship. He has performed with such notable artists as Clark Terry, McCoy Tyner, Wynton Marsalis, Marcus Roberts, Kenny Barron, Michael Feinstein, and Kurt Elling. He served as a house drummer for NBC's show Maya and Marty, and is a founding teaching artist for Jazz at Lincoln Center's Jazz for Young People program. And this past summer, Bryan produced Jazz at Pride, a celebration of the LGBTQIA+ community within the jazz community, a landmark event that brought together over 30 musicians and coincided with the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall riots. Welcome, Bryan. How are you?
I'm wonderful. Thank you so much for having me, Andy.
Great. So I thought we would just start today's conversation off with just a little bit about each of your experiences in jazz, especially as it relates to gender and inclusion. So in just sort of as we always go in our Zoom screen order, I'll go clockwise, and maybe Alexa, you can kick us off.
Sure, sounds great. Thanks, Andy. So I grew up in West Hartford, Connecticut. I grew up in a non-musical family. My parents are not musicians, but they're super supportive. And my grandmother actually played piano on the radio during the Great Depression to provide for her family. So I feel really lucky to have had that kind of story behind me. There was never any question in my mind that a female or female identifying individual could be a professional musician in whatever way they wanted. So my first influence actually on the saxophone came about when I was in elementary school and attending one of the local high school jazz concerts. The town of West Hartford just coincidentally had a really fantastic public school jazz education program. So I was really lucky to just kind of have been brought through that program. And Erica Von Kleist was the alto saxophonist at the time at the school. And Erica went on to have an incredible career, and she's just doing such amazing things now. And my heater just turned on, so I'm sorry if you have a little bit of a low hum here. I'll turn that up shortly. Just know I'm toasty warm over here. So she was the first person I saw play the saxophone, which again, I feel like is super rare. You know, many people that I met along the way and that I still meet, even if it's just somebody on the train that sees my saxophone, you know, like, I can't believe that you're a woman and you're playing the saxophone, or your lungs, do your lungs get tired? Do your hands get tired? Blah, blah, blah. And it's just like, hello, what planet are you living on? And no, like literally the first influence I ever saw on saxophone was a woman. So I'm so grateful for that experience, because I think, you know, what we'll get into later on is just talking about the importance of role models. And if I hadn't had that first role model, seeing somebody that looked like me or that I identified with, I don't know what direction I would have gone in. All that to say, have been so grateful to have incredible mentors along the way, and just best friends who are going through the same thing. Roxy is one of my closest friends, and we've shared many stories and have made so many great memories. Sherry Miracle and the Diva Jazz Orchestra. Sherry's a mentor to both of us. There are just so many incredible people who have made it their mission, you know, to expand and make sure that jazz is inclusive. And I think that's the goal of this chat today, is just to inspire and motivate and make everybody aware, you know, that these things are happening and how can we make a positive change.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that with us. Next, maybe we can go to Roxy.
Sure. All right. So, yeah, I grew up in a family with not any jazz musicians or professional musicians in that sense, but very musical family. And, you know, both my grandmothers played piano in the church and played me jazz records from the time I was a infant, Count Basie and stuff like that. So I think jazz was always in the air, so to speak. And my parents are very, you know, always had music playing in the house. I think that in terms of gender, my parents are very, very feminist. And what that means is, you know, they brought me up to not only think like, oh, I can do anything boys can do, but just that I was very aware of gender issues from a young age. My parents chose to give me my mom's last name. She kept her maiden name when they got married, and they made a decision to give me her last name as opposed to my dad's. So from a very young age, I was faced with questions about, you know, gender roles and tradition and stereotypes in our society. And then, you know, when I got into music, I started on piano. When I really fell in love with jazz was from playing the saxophone. And I came across the saxophone because all the cool boys were doing it. And I happened to be a straight woman in it. So it was like I had a crush on all these boys, and they were going to play the saxophone. So I found myself automatically, you know, one of the only girls on that instrument at a very young age because of that. But what happened was, as I continued, you know, I started to look around and find myself the only girl in most musical settings, and those were primarily jazz settings. By the time I was in 7th grade, I had gotten into the advanced jazz band, and it was all of my female peers were in the intermediate. So I had already kind of, you know, it was sort of filtering the girls into the lower level bands. And so by high school, I was very aware that in jazz, there were gender issues, that there wasn't, you know, like Alexa's saying, there could be work in the inclusivity realm, and also representation, which just for those of you who haven't maybe been well versed in this type of dialogue, I want to clearly define both of those terms. So inclusivity being an environment in which people feel included, in which you see, you know, actions being taken that make people feel included. Representation, on the other hand, is something where you're just seeing people being equally represented. So you see diversity because you see the spectrum of humans that exist in any given population. So in jazz, we have an underrepresentation of specifically women. We do have other issues. We have issues of intersectionality, which means, you know, the idea that every human has different identities. So I am a woman, but I'm also a white woman. I'm a straight woman. I come from a middle class family. I'm well, you know, I'm able-bodied. So there's many different factors of privilege and we can't have this discussion without that. So anyway, you know, all of that in mind, I was aware of these issues from a very young age because I looked around and didn't see people that looked like me. I was getting comments like Alexa from my first performances. I think my first performance, public jazz performance, was in 6th grade at the Red Apple grocery store. And my middle school jazz band played there. And I think from about that first performance, I regularly got the comment, "You sound like an old Black man." And I was like, is that a good thing? I don't know. Um, you know, I just thought I sounded like me. Now I realize that that is intended to be a compliment, and we can talk maybe more about that later too. Hidden backhanded compliments. But I did experience what, you know, I would say everything from comments that are pretty much harmless but insulting, like that in the lungs. I've gotten all of that, all the way through sexual harassment and sexual assault related to jazz. You know, not, I know like many women have, like the odds are bad just in our society for women. But I think, you know, for jazz, it may be worse just because the culture is misogynistic. It is very much stuck in the past, and not only in the past, but it's almost built on these types of values. So it's centered around, you know, being in a club environment, and clubs in general are already a little bit, you know, steeped in rape culture. And so that's existing. There's this idea that a musician has to tour to make a living, and touring traditionally means, you know, the ultimate version of a man leaving the home to provide for the family. So there's many, many reasons, which I'm sure we'll get more into. But I think for me, I was very aware all along that these were issues, that I was experiencing these issues, and that really negatively affected my relationship with music. I loved it so much that I kept going, but it was in spite of this environment and this culture that I felt very strongly, and in many ways was aware. In many ways it was, it took me years to kind of unpack like what had happened and understand that it wasn't normal, that the things that I was experiencing were actually outside the realm of healthy or normal, or even what my male peers had experienced. They just didn't even have to go through a lot of the things I went through. And then as I got older, and started to unpack those things and got out of school and into the professional world, I think that now we're in a time, and I feel very fortunate that we're in this time where everyone is being more aware of these issues, so we can talk about them. So it's made an opportunity for me to make a place for myself in this music through talking about these things. So Andy, I appreciate you making space for that too. But it's always been very closely related to my actual music for me. And I think, you know, founding Women in Jazz organization was a natural thing in order to provide more spaces where women can talk about music, can play music without it having to be attached to such an unhealthy situation, if you will. So I'm sure we'll get into other things. I don't want to take up all the time.
Oh, thank you. And last but certainly not least, Bryan.
Roxy, you could have just kept going. That was that was great. Yeah, I think that Roxy just brought up intersectionality, which is extremely important when we talk about any sort of gender role, or we talk about privilege in general. You know, I have the privilege of being a cisgendered male, you know. So just off the bat, especially within I think all of music, but especially within jazz, that gives me just like a leg up, because I'm one of the guys. But at the same time, I'm not one of the guys, because there's that element of I identify as a gay man. I'm a queer man, and I'm a queer man of color, which you know, I don't like to use the word disadvantages, but it definitely it removes certain areas of privilege from me. And in discussions about gender, I think it's so easy, and it's something that I have to catch myself, and I have to continually work on. It's so easy to be like, but I have A, B, and C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J to deal with, and and at the end of the day, we're all not even fighting for a place, or fighting for a voice, but just fighting for the ability to just exist, and to work, and to do what we love, and to form meaningful relationships, and that's something that should just be so basic. It should be so basic, and yeah, it's why it's important to have these sorts of conversations. Representation, as Roxy and Alexa both pointed to, is so important. For me specifically, I think about growing up from the time I was very little to, through my teenage years. I grew up around strong women of color. I mean, we all know my dad. Like, my dad's like, nah. But my mom, she's in charge. That's just the way. That's the way that it is. Um, and I think that growing up around strong women of color really shaped the way that I view, how, I guess, how I kind of push away more from the traditional, like, kind of archetypes of kind of structural uh, what kind of structure should exist within jazz in terms of gender roles. Like, I remember early on, there was a conversation just like in my school band about whether women should be allowed to play like heavier marching instruments. And that seemed ridiculous to me. Like, well, can she hold the bass drum? Can she hold the snare? I'm like, what? I'm like, we're all like freshmen in high school. We all weigh 120 pounds. I don't think it really matters at this point, you know. And even further, just like having, I in high school, Shirazette Tenon, who's a fantastic drummer, she was in my hometown. She was attending the university there, and she was kind of like my mentor, all throughout high school, and even, being in the city, she's my big sister, and having a queer female drummer, as kind of like one of my mentors, someone who looked out for me. I think that's been really important in my life in general, like outside of this conversation, because she can do anything that a man can do, and will let you know it twice, and I think that's important. I think it's important as a cisgendered male in jazz to really kind of go above and beyond, in terms of just checking your own privilege, checking yourself, constantly checking in with yourself. And it doesn't have to be in a way that is demonstrative for other people. It doesn't have to be in a way that is self-loathing or destructive. But I think that it's important to just kind of check in and be like, all right, where am I right now? Am I listening? I think that's huge. Like, am I listening, and am I hearing what other people have to say? Yeah, I think that's all I have to say for right now.
Thank you, Bryan. I heard all of you really talk about, you know, inclusivity and the sort of divide that exists in jazz. Can you all maybe talk a little bit about some of the factors you see as contributing to the exclusivity, or not being as inclusive as we'd like to be?
Sure. So I think the first thing is we have to realize that we don't exist in a bubble or vacuum. We exist within whatever community we're in. And within that town, or within that school, within that town, within that state, within the United States, and within the world, there's many different little cultures and communities. And so socialization plays a big factor into everybody's growing up and everybody's dealings with each other and everybody's political structures that they are existing within. So if we're talking about jazz as a whole, we have jazz as its own culture, and there is a community of jazz as a whole, right? But then if we're talking about like why are no girls signing up for jazz instruments at this particular program, that's a very small microcosm and little climate to look at. But it's also being affected by general things. So I think that some general things are affecting all of us. And some of those general things are like gender stereotypes in our society, the way that we socialize girls and boys, very binary from a very young age. All of this plays into, by the time you get to an age where you would even play jazz or play a jazz instrument, we already have so many preconceptions of what we can or cannot do as a kid, and all the adults around you have even more preconceptions and expectations about what you should or should not do. And I think that, going back to like my experience where my parents are completely super feminist, they didn't have the same should and shouldn'ts for me. And like Alexa said, she has very supportive parents. And like, I think, it's very well known and well documented that jazz is not traditionally a female music or field or career. And furthermore, especially the instruments that are primarily jazz instruments, like drums, bass, guitar, saxophone, trumpet, trombone. You see more women playing piano, which is also a jazz instrument. You see more women singing, which is also can be in jazz. And sometimes you might see the extraneous instruments like flute, clarinet, violin. But to choose an instrument, instruments are gendered. So that's already when a kid enters a situation where they might choose saxophone like I did, if their parents are going like, no, we don't want you to blow because that looks phallic, or we think like, oh no, like Bryan said, that instrument's too big for you, you can't play that instrument, like stuff like that, that is a bigger cultural problem. That's not jazz specific. We see this in other genres. And then as we get older and we start to improvise, because that usually happens a little bit later in people's, unfortunately, in people's jazz education, we get into a time, typically around middle school, maybe high school, where girls are going through puberty, and usually slightly before boys. So you're dealing with hormonal factors, you're dealing with what happens when you're socialized and you're going into adolescence. Girls are taught very specific things about the way they should act and the way that they should behave, and so are boys. And for girls, a lot of those social ways that we're expected to behave do not align with jazz values, especially improvisation. They do not align with taking risks. They do not align with improvisation itself. They don't align with saying, I want to take a solo. They don't, none of the things that help you be a good improviser or a good jazz musician are personality things that girls are being taught are good. They're being taught, don't raise your hand. Like there are studies that girls, even when girls know the answers in classrooms, they're not raising their hands. Like that's not just jazz, right? So they're not going to volunteer for things. They're definitely not going to try to compete with a boy. They're not going to want to appear to know more than anyone else. So there's like so many factors at that age. And then, I started to get into this also before, but as we get to kind of the next age level and all of these factors start to filter girls out of the picture. as you go into like, okay, what am I going to do for college? Well, with jazz, you have to know I'm going to be a jazz musician before, usually before you go to college, but if not, when you go to college, you're going to be asking that question. And then, maybe some people after college, but most people are like, I'm going to jazz school. I'm going to go be a jazz musician. And, frankly, what, girls thinking then you have to be asking, what does a career look like? And by the time you're getting into your 20s, women are expected to start thinking about, how do I raise a family if I also want to have a career? This is the questions being asked. When I was a freshman in college, 18 years old, I sat down at the cafeteria with my class, my friends in jazz school. This is a jazz performance degree. So all the freshmen were there. It was me and there were a few other guys, right? I was the only girl. Big surprise. And interestingly, talking about intersectionality, religion, I think, plays into this as well. I grew up without religion. And so that was another reason that I had less expectations, gender expectations. The boys that I was sitting with, one was a Catholic, one was a Mormon, one was a Jew, and one was very like evangelical Christian. They all looked at me and they were like, how are you going to have a family and be a jazz musician? They just all started staring at me and I was like, what? Like, why is this even a question? I don't know. I'm 18. I don't know if I want a family. Also, I probably do, but like, do you want a family? Like, how are you going to do that? I don't know. I'm 18. Like, I don't know what any of this looks like. I'm a freshman in college. So these are questions that women are facing, whether or not we're aware of it. And so as you start to think about that, it's like, well, for any jazz musician, it's almost impossible to like make a living, to have a family, to even just build a career alone is like very hard these days. So I think when you start to add in gender and expectations, it's really, you feel like the world is stacked against you a little bit. So all of that isn't even jazz dynamics. That's all external, general world, socialization. So as a society, of course, we're changing and we're moving in a more liberal direction, but these are things that we can't, as a jazz community, necessarily change. We can just do a little bit better, I think, about addressing that these are factors. And then I want to let you guys talk, but that's not even getting into jazz culture, which, as I've already said, I'll let someone else say it again, but we know it's even more unhealthy than general culture.
Awesome, Roxy. Thank you. I will chime in sort of at the middle school education situation. One thing, that really strikes me in terms of this subject, in terms of, where are we really missing that idea of having a role model, that idea of giving young female identifying instrumentalists the support that they need to take their passion or enthusiasm for the music in the direction that they want. And a huge part of that is in music education, because many of us, I think, probably came through school with male band directors. And I think especially at that time in middle school, it requires such sensitivity on the educator's part to know what both sides, all sides of the spectrum are going through. And I think, that's just oftentimes not there. And it's really frustrating because at that point, when the female identifying students are not feeling free and open in that space, that's as soon as that happens, as soon as maybe they do take a risk, maybe they do raise their hand for a solo and they feel that it wasn't their best or something like that. All it takes is one moment of kind of discouragement or put down or fear or something that, somebody feeling that they were not successful. And then you could lose that person forever. That could be it. That could be the last time that young girl is in band class. And I think Roxy may have turned me on to this there's this idea that you know, if a young female identifying student is going to, you know, put their name in the hat for something, or if you know, if the opportunity to audition for something is there, or to take that solo, or to perform a scale at the beginning of rehearsal, you know, the female identifying student is less likely to raise their hand because they want to perform that 100% perfectly. But studies show, and Roxy, please correct me if I'm wrong, that, you know, that boys at that age are just like, oh sure, I'll do it, we'll see what happens, and they're totally fine to, you know, present themselves at maybe 50-60% or less. Who knows what could happen, you know? And like, to Roxy's point of young women keeping their hands down when they know the answers, we are our own worst critics a lot of the time. I think all of us, no matter who you are, you want to do a good job, you want to succeed, but when you have that added pressure in that situation in the band room, it's really, really difficult. So if we have any, you know, any educators watching, or any students that want to become music teachers, or students that, you know, can even bring feedback into making their classrooms feel more open and more inclusive. I know a lot of teachers that might, on the whiteboard or the chalkboard or whatever, put up you know, a record of the week or artist of the week or something like that, just to have something to talk about in class. And I bet you the diversity in that playlist of whoever's coming through can be greatly improved. So making sure that we're pulling charts by female arrangers and composers, making sure that we're playing videos and recordings of female identifying musicians. It doesn't, you know, of whatever the songs that you're working on in your jazz band, or even just, you know, if you're encouraging a student to you know, pick up the trumpet, yes, tell them about Miles Davis and Clark Terry and all these people, but what about Flora Bryant? Or what about Ingrid Jensen? What about Tanya Darby? So many incredible people that we can really be pushing in terms of letting students know the spectrum of musicians who have made it and are forging ahead in careers, in who came from situations where they likely were feeling excluded. So I think just really taking a closer look at the educational perspective of it is super important, just to see like, what can we do? And if you're an educator, like, how can you make any, it doesn't, I'm not even saying just specifically female identifying, but any student that's a minority or underrepresented, how can we make them feel more included, and how can we support them to get to the next level at whatever stage that might be for them, because we're all at different stages. So it's not giving somebody extra attention, it's not paying extra attention to anyone, it's tailoring your instruction to customize and individualize needs.
Just want to jump in to add on to that. And Alexa's talking about a word, equity. And equity is a different concept than equality. And so I think in my definitions, I must also point this out. And equity is exactly what Alexa just said, but, you know, it's coming from a place of different people have different needs. If we're looking at intersectionality, just everybody is unique. We're coming from different places with a different set of privilege. Everybody has privilege, and everybody's privilege looks different. And some people have more privilege than others. And so if Alexa and I are coming to the same table to eat dinner, but I didn't have breakfast or lunch, I might eat more than Alexa. And that's not unfair. That just means we both go home full. You know, so if you have two students and one is coming to you with no support to play jazz and, you know, no background of a family listening to music, they're going to need maybe a little bit more support from their teachers and role models. And that's what equity is, versus equality, where you say, well, it's not fair if so-and-so gets this or doesn't get that or whatever. So just wanted to throw that out there. And Alexa, I wanted to add on to one other thing you said about, you know, this idea of pressure that somebody feels. And for those of you watching, if you are ever in a situation where you're the underrepresented population, I'm sure you've felt this, but often in jazz, girls specifically feel a lot of pressure to be perfect because they're the only girl. And so actually the weight of girls performing as a whole falls onto their shoulders. So they feel like if they take a solo and it's bad, not only do they look bad, but they're making all women in jazz look bad because they didn't sound good. So there's a very huge amount of pressure that many girls feel because of the underrepresentation, that I just wanted to kind of throw that out there as well.
I actually, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg mentioned that in, was it the CNN? I forget what documentary it was. She said that very same thing about being the only woman in her class in law school. And I think maybe if we have any students watching this story between Roxy and I might be interesting. So this is not stuff that, I mean, I guess I should really speak for myself, but this is not stuff that we have overcome ourselves yet either. Just I think it was like 3 or 4 years ago, an audition opened up for Arturo Farrell's Afro Latin Jazz Orchestra, and I was just about to start school at Juilliard for my master's, and I saw the promotion for it, and I thought like, okay, maybe I'll try this. Maybe, I mean, that would be amazing. That would be so cool. Wow. But like, there's no way I would even get selected, and I would have to, miss some of these things. And, it was a lot to coordinate, and I just wasn't sure if I was going to get it. And so I was talking to Roxy, and Roxy was like, you can't take yourself out of the running first, but like before somebody else takes you out of the running, like you need to put your name in the hat, because for all you know, like everybody else that wanted to apply is like saying like having some issue or conflict, and they're just not going to apply, and I could be like the only person applying. And either way, I mean, Roxy was incredibly supportive, and saying like, if you're a hard worker, you'll put in the time, you'll put in the energy. If there's anything you don't know, you'll work hard to get there. And you're not going in assuming that you'll get it, but you are prepared and giving yourself the best, best foot forward, giving yourself the opportunity to succeed. So I think for a lot of us, the first assumption is, oh, that's not going to happen. There's no way that's going to happen. Or like, oh, there must be a zillion other people out there who are better than me. And that's something that I live by too. There's always going to be somebody out there better than me. And I want to play with that person because I want to get my butt kicked. But you can't be discouraged by that. So just really like taking ownership of your abilities and your strength, and being open to criticism, open to growth and learning. Because if you put yourself in those positions where you are able to grow, you are going to go so much further than people who refuse to put themselves in those situations and take risks and be challenged, and who end up staying in their own little bubble in a very closed-minded lifestyle. So I just thought that might be of interest, because it's something that even for Roxy and I, who are two professional musicians, it was an exchange that was still like so recent, and I'm sure it won't be the last one.
Definitely. And, part of that conversation too was Alexa saying, I can't do it 100% because I have to miss this rehearsal. Like, they told me I can't miss any rehearsals. And she actually called them and said, I really appreciate this opportunity, but I can't do it. And I was like, you're calling them back. And
That's right.
give them the option, give them the option to say no. And I think this is really important also, like for anybody, students who might be auditioning to things, just to remember that, just because you think you don't qualify doesn't mean that you don't qualify. Sometimes people will ask for more than they know they're going to get. And I was going to say, oh, we'll come back to it. But anyway, yeah.
I'll jump in. I think that as educators, especially as clinicians and band directors, what Roxy and Alexa are saying is so important. I think I remember a time, I think I was in Seattle actually, Roxy's old stomping ground, and I was visiting an elementary school, and there was a room full of kids who have been playing their instruments for 2 years, maybe even less. And I was going around the room, and we were all playing like 2 or 3 notes over a blues, and everyone had to play their notes, and the exercise was using good time and good rhythm, and it goes through all these boys and kind of like a concert band setting, and it gets to this girl, and before the girl can even put her her horn to her mouth, the boys are laughing, and she can't play, and you know, the band director, you know, is just sitting there and he's, oh, okay, guys, all right. You know, and it gives off this very boys will be boys, you know, vibe. Um, and afterwards, you know, I just kind of point, you know, I just kind of point blankly said, well, none of you can play. Like, you've been playing for 2 years, like, and that's okay. That's the point of this. We're here to learn. I was like, but you know, in math class when she's kicking your butt, I asked her, I was like, what's your favorite subject? She said math. I was like, who has math class with her? When she's kicking your butt in math, does she, you know, take your test out of your hand and laugh at you? And they were like, no. And I was like, all right, jazz is about being supportive. Jazz is about listening. Jazz is about communication. We have to be supportive with one another, otherwise we can't play together. And, you know, that was more for the band director than it was for the kids. It was like, this in and of itself, by you kind of, boy, like, that's a lesson. That's setting up behavior and telling these young people that this behavior is acceptable, and it's something that they'll carry into high school and into university and into their adult lives. So I think just right from the get-go that can be difficult. And two, I mean, you know, coming from, you know, a parent who was a high school band director and you know, uncles who were in aunts who were high school and middle school band directors, like, I understand how difficult, actually I don't understand how difficult it is, but I know that you're in the trenches. But I think just from hearing Roxy and Alexa speak about their experiences, it's just a constant reminder to not treat every situation like a monolithic experience. You know, I think that there's a danger in that, and doing our best to be aware of everything that's going on around us to the best of our abilities. And beyond that, not falling into that trap of, you know, oh, well, this kid seems really excited about the music, so that's the kid I should give more opportunity to. Or this kid is the one who always, you know, raises his hand for solos. Or this is the kid who, you know, he has a really good sound on, you know, just that's in our nature to be like, oh, this kid's excited, I should, you know, try to uplift them. Because what Roxy and Alexa, at least what I think they're saying, is that so often it's not young women who are in those situations. And so we just have to be very mindful. And that's a trap that I fall into. And I have 2 hours for a clinic. I see a kid who's super excited about jazz, and I'm like, yeah, you! Like, you're me. I'm excited about jazz. You know, and just being more mindful of everyone else in the room as well. Equity.
Yeah, I want to add on to that too, which is sometimes when we think about equity or equality, we think it means being easier on somebody. But actually, I think one common problem that I'm seeing a lot, not just in music, not just with gender, is in education, a lack of expectation. The level of expectation is being lowered around the country. And I think we equate this partially to parent styles differing over time, that there's this generation of helicopter parents, or that, you know, kids are more entitled these days or something like this. But, you know, I think all of the three of us, at least, were, you know, Alexa and Bryan and I are good friends, and we all came from very high expectation programs where, you know, teachers showed you love by saying, no, that was not it. Do better. Like, go practice. Like, that's not it. And when you're too easy on kids, they, you know, they will rise to whatever bar you put up there. And so when we're talking about equity, and you go, you know, even if you're teaching a clinic, and you go in there, I oftentimes experience mostly girls who are so scared to try anything. And I will stand there and yell in their face until they give it to me, because I know it's going to take them twice as long. But I don't give up on it just because I think, oh, they're not going to do it. It's like, no, they will. You just have to find the right way to ask. And sometimes being more hard on somebody is actually the right way. It's just, you know, like I think Alexa was saying, like having, like, kind of also being supportive and showing them, like, because you want them to realize what the reward is, and the reward is internal. They're going to feel the reward when they get it right. They're going to be like, oh, you know, it has nothing to do with me as their teacher. It's a process that you're showing them, like it's going to take them time to get it. But, you know, raising the expectation often is the answer for equity, not, you know, being easier on somebody or giving them, letting them get away with more or holding them to a lower expectation. That actually hurts them in the long run. And I think that's what we find oftentimes with girls. And honestly, going back to, you know, just like hormonal stuff, I remember in middle school going into my jazz band director's office every day at lunch and crying. Like, I don't know why. It doesn't matter why. I couldn't control myself emotionally. And knowing that that was a safe space also enforced the idea that jazz was like my thing, because I had a space to go where I could be myself and it wasn't weird. He was supportive and patient. And, you know, letting him see that, like a lot of teachers, because we have this very personal relationship in music, we have private lessons, we have these like intimate settings. I think when girls are challenged, especially at that age, they can cry, and this scares teachers. It scares me when my students cry. I'm like, oh no, I did this to you. But that's very common for girls, you know, and it's honestly, it's common for anyone, boys, girls, any person. When you're pushing yourself to a limit where you actually start to grow. And in music, that's going to happen constantly if you keep going. Like, that's jazz in a nutshell, is like, how uncomfortable can I make myself and still continue to play? And so knowing that, like, you know, equity wise, you yourself might have to be uncomfortable in order to find the thing that helps support that student. It's not going to look like what helped you always. It might be something completely different that they need in order to succeed. So expectation, and this kind of leads into my second point I wanted to make, which is this idea of affirmative action. I want to go back to Alexa's story, because she actually got that job. She got the audition, she got the position in the orchestra. And I think that one of the things we talked about, if I remember correctly, Alexa, is this idea that what if people think I just got this because they needed more girls in the band? And how crappy that feels. And almost every single thing I've gotten in life, I've had that feeling like, well, did I just get this because I'm a girl? You know, because I'm a woman? You know, and sometimes the answer is yes. And then should I feel bad about that? And I've heard so many comments from people like, oh, well, I've been trying to get that for so many more years. I have so much more experience. And when we're talking about equity, again, we need to look, I think, as a community at the bigger picture, because sometimes it does take more, you know, to get us in a place where we are all contributing. And so if we're talking about, you know, anything from a position at Juilliard on faculty down to an elementary jazz band and getting first tenor chair, these are all the same thing. And if we want to create an inclusive community in jazz, if we want to create a representative art form that represents our diverse population of America, we need to create opportunities for people to participate who are not participating. And if that means giving them more opportunity to practice, you know, giving them the opportunity before they might be fully ready, and then just giving them the resources they need to meet that challenge, then that's what we need to do. We need to ask ourselves, what can I do, and why in my community is there not a representative, diverse population? And what am I doing that is not making people feel included? What is this inclusive? How can I be more inclusive? And sometimes that means these ideas of affirmative action, which really just means giving people opportunities and giving them more resources. And that's what equity looks like.
I really liked, well, thank you all, first of all, for your comments so far. Real quick, I did want to anyone that's listening and participating with us tonight, I put this in the chat, but you're welcome to add questions, comments throughout in the chat, or add questions in the Q&A. You know, even if we hold off for a little bit and kind of do those all at the end, you please send them as they come to you. I know I often forget where I'm what I had in my mind. And Roxy, I really was struck by the comment about, you know, raising the bar and pushing people, and that made me think about, you know, going from that external world that you talked about that creates barriers, you know, just in general, socialization and the gendering of instruments and such. But I think we also hear and see that the sort of like over masculine competitiveness, the language and the talk that often is associated, that like whiplash kind of ensemble that can be seen as that negative experience. You know, what's the, you know, talking about balance between pushing people and setting high expectations, but not falling into what is traditionally seen as that overbearing, you know, jazz band director throwing the music stand across the room.
I want to say, you know, from my personal experience, my middle school jazz band director, Robert Nat, he's a living legend. And he would call people bonehead. He would yell and scream and be like, get out of here, bonehead, bonehead. You know, he was the guy throwing stuff. But he was also the guy, like I said, who would invite me to his office to get my crying out at lunch. And, you know, he always said to me, if they're going to quit, they're going to quit. They might as well find out now, right? Like, we're not all cut out for this, and that's okay. And if you're afraid to push people away, then you're going to be avoiding. It's kind of like a relationship, like you're dating someone and you're so afraid that they're going to break up with you that you don't tell them anything real about yourself, right? Well, the real risk is that you're in a fake relationship and it's built on a lie. And so the same thing is true with jazz. If you're so afraid to get deep with your students because you're afraid they're going to quit, you're going to miss the opportunity to connect with the ones that really have potential and really might go somewhere. The record of people that came out of that program, I mean, many of you may know them. I mean, myself, Riley Mulherker, Ann Drummond, Tatum Greenblatt, Casa Overall. I mean, the list goes on and on. Josh Deutsch, Nick Roseborough, you know, these people I looked up to. Like, for a town, you know, Seattle is, at the time, it was about 500,000 people population. For me to list that many people in my 4-year age range that became professional jazz musicians, like, that's what you gain if you really push your students. You know, yeah, the rest of them quit, but like, they weren't going to be jazz musicians. Like, and that's okay, right? And in the meantime, many people who didn't become jazz musicians learned what it means to practice something diligently and get better. They learned about success and they have applied that to other things in their lives. Many of my friends who were in that program but knew they weren't going to pursue music or jazz, but they actually, you know, succeeded in other things that they did because they saw, oh, if I'm interested in something and I work on it, this is the value, is the process of learning, going deeper. You know, you have that relationship with music. So I don't think you should be afraid. And I think that that I didn't watch the movie because I just heard everybody hated it so much. But that stereotype was my teacher, and it was actually a good thing. It's this idea of they're exposing the process that you really will have to go into with yourself if you want to be great at anything, whether it's becoming the president of the United States or a jazz trumpet player. You have to challenge yourself every day to go deeper with it. And whether that means like reading books every day or practicing surgery or, you know, learning etudes, you know, this is something that you can't protect children from. They need to figure out what that process is. And having somebody, I think, you know, the only thing is just make sure you're also inspiring them with something, giving them stuff to listen to, showing them what it can sound like. And I think that brings us back to having diverse role models, having a representative selection of role models, whether that's recordings or guest artists. You know, I think that we come back to Alexa full circle there.
I mean, something I'll say is that I've definitely spent a lot of time uh, trying to figure out what that balance is. You know, the way I came up, it was like, you know, I was crying at like 6 years old because, you know, people, namely my father and like, you know, Reggie Thomas and, you know, I remember playing at the Bistro when I was in St. Louis when I was like 15 or 16. And I remember after the first set, Reggie Thomas looks at me and he goes, "When I'm up here, I'm not your Uncle Reggie." And he was like, you need to go practice. Don't come up here to next set sounding that sad." And I was like, what am I gonna say? He's right. Like what? You know? Um, but I think that yeah, I at this point in my life, you know, I'm not willing to lie to kids for money. Um, and I understand that that also comes with the privilege of being able to like come in and do my thing and then leave, and I don't have to like deal with parents the next day. Um, but I'm just not willing to lie to kids for money and be like, you guys sound amazing, and you guys, and I have friends who will do that. I know professionals who I respect who go in and lie to kids, and they're great educators, but they go in and tell everyone that they sound amazing and that they're all the best, and that's just not me. You know, I want everyone to do better. I don't want anyone to quit. Like I want to genuinely make everyone that I encounter fall in love with jazz and find at least some element of improvisation or jazz or ensemble playing that they love and that they can connect with and then apply to other areas of their lives. Um, but you know what Roxy's talking about just like honesty and beyond honesty, clarity. You know, why am I yelling at you right now? It's like what am I trying to get? What am I trying to get for you? I remember the first person that I ever made cry was a young lady at NIU Jazz Camp in 2009. I was 19 years old, and like she was sobbing, you know. And I remember her like band director came and like picked her up, and he was furious with me, and he was like, "How could you?" And I was like, you know, I did feel bad about it, but you know, she came back the next week, and she came back the next year, and she came back the year after that, and she came back the year, and now she's a band director making kids cry, you know. So yeah, I think it goes back to what Roxy and Alexa were just talking about, and uh, sometimes you know, sometimes even when other people expect you to go soft on a kid, you have to like just kind of stick to your guns, you know.
I can just piggyback off of that. I think, you know, the this panel is on, you know, gender and equality and inclusivity in jazz, but I think, you know, we're we're zooming out and we're looking at the entire world, right? And literally zooming out. We're taking a look at the entire world. And what I always tell my parents that come to that send their kids to my jazz camp, you know, a lot of at my program, we teach students by ear, so they don't need any sheet music or anything like that. We did eventually bring it in for like big bands when the big bands got a little bit larger and more advanced, and they could do like head charts and things like that. But a lot of people were questioning, you know, why this is so weird. You know, my kid is used to taking band and this way and with the sheet music and blah blah blah. And the students had never improvised. You know, they just kind of were checking in and checking out of band. And I like try to explain to people the value of, you know, taking your eyes off the page, eyes off the stand, and learning this music by ear the way that it has largely been passed down, allows you to connect with the people next to you. And so I think, like, to Roxy and Bryan's points, the larger view here is like we are instilling just necessary human qualities, like skills that we need everybody to go out in the world with, like respect, responsibility, empathy, sympathy, having a good sense of work ethic, time management, dedication, public speaking, whether you're announcing a tune on your first concert or whether you're just trying to explain something to your bandmates, being able to work as a team, all of that stuff is what comes out of this. And it's really amazing. And I think that at the end of the day, like those students who maybe quit or who don't go on, they go on to be, I'm sure, ambassadors, hopefully ambassadors of the music. And those students who maybe become doctors or vets or teachers or whatever are people who can subscribe to their local venue and be, supporting the music in other ways, who can be donating their old instrument to a charitable organization providing lessons for underprivileged kids, who can help support an underprivileged student who can't pay for lessons, who can, spread the word about local performances, who can follow a particular artist and support them in their career. So just these human needs and qualities, I think, are what really make this whole thing beautiful for me. And the more people that we can reach by having, a more diverse group of students to work with, an audience and to play for, and people to work with, is what makes, I think, jazz so unique in making the world a better place. Not to be too cliche, but here we are. And I think that's my 2 cents.
I have to add on to the end of that too, because you started to say something that like I always usually lead with whenever I'm talking about women in jazz or gender in jazz. I do a lot of panels like this, and I usually like to make sure at the beginning that, when we're in a real room together, that we're all on the same page before we start this conversation, because it can be challenging sometimes. And because we aren't actually looking at our audience members, I wasn't thinking of it, but I think it's so important to say that, why does it matter? Why does gender in jazz as a topic matter? Why does it matter if we don't have a representative population in our music? And the answer is that, if we did, it would benefit all of us. If you think about any type of anything in society, whether it's art or science or anything, the more people are contributing to it, the better that thing becomes, right? So like, if we didn't have Thomas Edison, I don't know, if we didn't have, Hillary Clinton, I don't know, just pick random people in history. And if you don't have that person's ideas contributing, that field doesn't get moved along, right? And so in jazz, we have these geniuses. We have John Coltrane, we have Charlie Parker, we have Louis Armstrong. We also have people like Mary Lou Williams, who are lesser known, but now are getting a little bit more acknowledgement and recognition. What we find out now is that she actually influenced people like Dizzy Gillespie, who wouldn't be who they are without her. But what we don't have is a list of names that is as long as the men of women who contributed to this music, who shaped the music. And what that tells me is this music isn't as good as it could be because there weren't as many people contributing. And so what we want is to build an art form that supports people contributing. We want an art form that is so representative that anybody feels comfortable and included to contribute to the art form. So if you don't mind, I want to share Women in Jazz Organization's mission statement, which is, it talks about wanting to help even the playing field in jazz so that women and non-binary people can contribute and participate to the art form, leading to an overall improved, more rich, diverse, and successful art form. And so at the root of all these conversations, it's important to remember, why are we talking about this? Because if you are a man, or if you are whatever that person in privilege in that specific conversation is, sometimes you're like, well, I can't really do anything. But the truth is, your experience will be improved if this is a problem, is addressed, because the music will be better. And not only the content itself, the art form, but the whole industry. If there are more people offering music and jazz, more people will want to connect, which means a bigger audience. It means more money. It means more opportunity to play, more venues, more record labels, more jazz writers publishing reviews. It just means, in general, a more thriving community. So it's not just women who benefit from talking about these issues. It's not just girls who benefit from talking about jazz education and gender. It's also men. It's all of us. We as a community, we as a society, and people who are not jazz musicians, even men who are not jazz musicians might benefit from the music being improved upon, from more access to hearing jazz, like on playlists or something. That's going to improve people's lives all over the world. So this might seem like, okay, I don't understand why this is important, or I don't understand why this is a problem, or I don't understand what I can do. But this is something that we can all, benefit from.
I think that's such an excellent point, and I feel foolish as a moderator for not starting with why this is so important. Because I do think that is something that, I've literally heard people sort of dismiss as like, there isn't really a problem. It's just the way it is, and it's fine. And I think it is really important to.
Andy, can I
do that? Yeah, jump in, Bryan.
I think that just because we're not all the way there, but we're entering a time where it's not socially acceptable to say that women shouldn't belong in jazz, or that queer people shouldn't belong in jazz, or any other. Does not mean that issue has been resolved. I think the point of these conversations is to continue an ongoing dialogue that can continue to influence hearts and minds. If I still receive death threats, on Instagram, as recently as August, people saying they're going to come to my house and shoot me. And that's easy to do when you can delete your account afterwards, So it's a conversation that needs to continue. And just because we're not hearing it in the band room, or it's not okay to say it in the green room at Dizzy's, that does not mean that we've rectified the situation. So I think that's something to keep in mind as well, because it's something that I hear all the time too. Well, we don't have a problem with women in jazz. Esperanza Spalding's on the cover of Jazz Time. We have a problem, but it's important to continue that conversation. That's all I want to add. I'm done. Thank you.
I guess as we're getting towards the end, and again, if anybody has questions that's watching and listening, please send them our way. But I'm just always curious for both suggestions and experiences. You guys have shared a lot, and we've talked a lot about role models, but other ways that educators can change their rooms, their behaviors, their what they do to make things more inclusive for all students, especially in the jazz world.
Sure. And I think this comment is such a great point to start with in answer to your question, which is bringing up this idea of jazz bros. One thing that we can all do better is just language. Jazz has a specific language that we use a lot, and it's masculine based. So it's hard to break language habits, because that is how we express ourselves. But, and we're not, I'm not perfect. None of us are perfect, but things that are gendered can just go in the trash can, I think. You don't need to say dudes, guys, man, any general term with a male generic can go in the trash can. I think going back to expectations, if you're in a classroom setting, there's things that you can actually do. You have the benefit of being in a classroom setting, whereas when you get into the professional realm, you're not going to have these opportunities as a musician. So what I'm talking about is, like, if you're grading, grade based on equity again. So is this person doing their best? Are they improving based on how the condition they came into the classroom? And the expectations need to be high. So what do I need to do as an educator to get them to my expectations? So if my expectations are that by the end of the year, every person has taken a solo, you're going to have to do different types of work with different types of students, right? And so I think making things normalized is important. So like, in jazz, if you want people to be able to solo, that means they need to try soloing. So you need to create an environment where they feel comfortable soloing. And in order to do that, I think the biggest tip I have is make it normal, make it an everyday thing so there's not so much pressure around it. Competition is great, but we all know about that already. Find other ways to motivate your students, additional ways. Competition's not inherently bad, but if it's the only way you're motivating your students, that is very testosterone based. That is male tradition. Let's find other ways, additional ways to inspire our students. And I think we have talked about role models, but I want to underscore that again. It's just so important. So, not only do I have a woman in my curriculum, but do I have equal women and men in my curriculum? Until you get to that point, just keep working in that direction. And I think also just holding yourself accountable. If you're a band director and you're running a jazz band or a jazz program, make sure that your jazz band looks as diverse as your band, or better. I don't know. So if it doesn't, start asking, how can I do this better? And Andy, I know you're asking us, how can they do better? But the first question is to say, am I doing okay? If you have 8 girls and 14 boys, you're probably thinking to yourself, I have so many girls in my jazz band. This is awesome. Guess what? That's a terrible number. I'm sorry. It's better than the national average, but it's still terrible. So just finding ways to, make it cool. Like, role models are not just people older, they're also peers. So if you can find a way to encourage a group of girls to be participating, make it social. Jazz is a social music. So start that culture young. Get them playing in different combos, get them practicing with their sectionals, get them rehearsing, like, mix it up. Don't feel like you have to be modeled after the Duke Ellington band or the Count Basie band, right? Those are just 2 models, but this music is larger than that, and there's different ways to approach that.
Also, be sure to get female clinicians and musicians into your band room. People like Roxy Coss and Alexa Tarantino, but also people like Mary Jo Papich. People, just having those women in your band room is going to enhance the vibe of your band room. It's going to open the eyes of your students, and it's going to instantly put role models for kids who especially aren't going and listening to recordings and trying to find recordings with Melba listed on them. Just seeing Roxy or Alexa in their band room is going to give them a role model without having to do any additional work. So
the only thing I would add is to talk to the parents and really try to, a lot of parents are not familiar with any of this, and they just know that their kid's going to jazz band once a week or every day, 4th period. So if you're finding that, a student has that spark, really making, spark meaning they are excited and passionate about the music. I would just say the more that you can do to kind of gently educate parents in kind of breaking down, like we started with, those kind of stereotypes, family stereotypes, all, instrument stereotypes, all of that stuff. The more that you can do to educate families and parents and break those barriers down, I think it's important for the students to have, supportive band room and supportive practice room at home.
And my sister and my sister's a elementary school teacher in North Carolina, and my brother and sister-in-law are high school educators in Alabama. And I know that speaking with parents, sometimes some of the troublesome language or troublesome ideas that you hear from students are coming directly from the parents, and still just doing your best, within the very strict parameters that you have to make sure that you're showing as much equal representation as you can within your band room for the 45 minutes a day that you have the students.
And I mean, that representation piece, I know we've had a lot of conversations with some of our teaching artists here about like how that plays out, not just with, talking about artists, especially contemporary artists, because I think that it's easier to find better representation in the world, contemporary musicians, but, we go back to like, what are we having students transcribe? It's all, from the same time period. And are they not just hearing some names, but are they listening? Are they transcribing? Are they studying a diverse list of names? Or is it, fighting that the same sort of list and lack of diversity that a lot of us, I think, came up with and who we were introduced to. So those are excellent points. I guess we're about out of time. Does anybody have any just sort of closing thoughts as we wrap up?
Thank you for having us and for making space for this discussion. I wish we could be together in person. You guys are all so amazing and inspiring, Roxy and Bryan and Andy and everyone at Jazz St. Louis. So thank you so much.
Ditto, and looking forward to more conversations in the next couple weeks about many areas of music. And it's been awesome. Now my head is spinning with a million things, so it's great. Yeah.
Yeah, I think with any good conversation, you come out with more questions than than necessarily answers. So if you're watching this either now or later and not live with us here, feel free to send questions in whatever format, comment you're watching on, and things can get passed on to any of these wonderful panelists. And again, don't forget to join us next week. The same three wonderful musicians we have with us here will be talking about composition and arranging next week. So once again, thank you, Roxy, Bryan, and Alexa, and we will see everybody very soon.